So I've been talking about how it's real hard just to be stuck at home the past couple of videos, so I thought I'd walk and stand 6 feet away from a friend, Stephen. Hi, Stephen. How are
Hey,
you?
I'm doing really well, Paul. It's good to see you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. How's walk down been for you?
It's been hard in ways. It's been sweet in ways. My son's taking his first steps, so it's definitely a time that we'll remember. We're hoping it ends soon, but we're finding things to be thankful in it.
Very good. Very good. You know, Stephen and I, along with some of the other leaders of the church, have been talking about ways to sort of come back after this lockdown. We've been asking lots of questions, haven't really come up with any great answers yet, but been asking questions. And Stephen, you've addressed some of concerns that we've had. What has been one of your concerns about coming back together?
Yeah, so on top of the concerns that everyone hopes that we have about safety in one hand, and then also doing what's spiritually necessary for the discipling of our people. On top of those things, I've been thinking and praying about how these questions have become hyper polarized. So there's some folks in our church who think that gathering together at all could be really irresponsible and against the health of everyone else. And then there are other people who think that those former people are just stupid and just are letting the government say whatever they want and restrict our rights. And basically both sides think that the other side is destroying the common good, and we get stuck in this gridlock where there's not really space for compromise or putting one in the shoes of another.
Yeah, that is a big concern. And, in Philippians in chapter 4, the Apostle Paul talks about two women who really needed to work together for the gospel. And so
Just
today...
agree in the Lord.
And the Lord, yeah. And so today we're going to be asking the question, how do we work together when we have such a different view of things from one another?
We've been talking in this series about how a Christian is someone who has a relationship with God. And last week we started to talk a little bit about how that relationship with God is more than just a personal thing, just me and God, but as a community thing, something that Christians share with one another. God does relate to us as individuals, but also as a group, as a community. We can learn from each other and encourage one another and join together in growing our understanding and enjoyment of God and the gospel. Now, we also said that this isn't always easy. Last week's reading plan ended by looking at the first few verses of Philippians chapter 4. There, Paul talks directly about specific individuals struggling to get along. They may have had different personalities or value systems that just were clashing. Not everything about gospel partnership is simple and straightforward. When people from different cultural backgrounds or even just different personalities start working together, they have a lot of differing expectations and value systems that they need to work through. One of the beauties of the gospel is that it gives Christians something to unite around, something to help them work through these differences. It's so tempting just to write people off and say it's my way or the highway. And we see that the Apostle Paul himself struggled with that. You can read about it in Acts 15 verses 36 to 40. But as Paul writes to the Philippians later in his life, he reminds them and points them back to the gospel as the thing that can help them overcome their differences. And that's the very heart of Philippians chapter 4. God is the one who helps bring the church together for mutual benefit so that he can bring peace into our world. Paul talks about this in the context of the local church, as well as the context of the church sending and supporting other people to go and spread the peace of God throughout the world. In both situations, the theme of joy in the gospel and trusting God are central to finding peace. It's here that we read Philippians 4:6, which might be a very familiar verse. It says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Not being anxious may sound like a bit of a pipe dream, especially with all that's going on at the moment, and if you think about the tenuous nature of relationships. But Paul's statement here isn't a rejection of the worry and the fear that we feel. Instead, he acknowledges the reality of our emotions, as well as the need that we have for direction to work through them. And so again, he returns to that primary relationship of the Christian life, calling us to talk to God about our anxieties. He reminds us that God is a God of peace. We come to God together to find peace. Both peace individually for what we struggle with, as well as peace for our community. We come together to God to find peace. When he says, let your requests be made known to God, the your used here is plural, you all. We can share our anxiety, as well as the hope and assurance that God will provide. Paul's own experience was that the church could work together, and he reminds the Philippians of their own example of how they were able to work through things, and not just work through them to have a fragile peace where they're walking on eggshells all the time, but to overcome their differences and work together for God's peace in the world. This is only possible when the church is founded on the gospel, when people come together because of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, sharing a relationship with God. This is something that I really need to be reminded of right now. As we start talking about coming out of quarantine and gathering again, we need to remember that we'll have different comfort levels. We'll have different opinions about when we should start gathering, how close we can get to one another, who we should be around. While we do have these different opinions, the centrality of the gospel remains. It's the gospel that will help us work through these differences. And so I'd invite you to study Philippians 4 with me this week. Let's take a closer look at this chapter and how we're called to unity around the gospel. There's a reading plan with some study questions in the video description, and you should feel free to leave a comment here with any questions you may have or thoughts you'd like to share. So let's study Philippians chapter 4 together this week and share the peace of Christ with each other and with the world.